Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, Nozick's utility monster in Mythic Europe. Nozick's utility monster is a thought experiment designed to poke a hole in the worldview of utilitarians, but it's adaptable to role-playing games. As is becoming customary for these posts on philosophy, I need to begin by oversimplifying a basic concept. Let's talk about utility and cake. Imagine there's a cake. Now, how is it we determine the just division of the cake between yourself and a friend of yours? If you're in Norman England, the law basically says that since everything in Britain belongs to the king, the cake was the king's, possibly with a slice off the side for the clergy. Roll on a few hundred years, and many rich families owned various things, and the answer to the cake problem was, well, who owns the cake? There was eventually an interesting counter-answer, which was whose labour was mixed with the ingredients to make the cake, and between these two, utilitarianism can seem like a useful mean. It asks, how is the cake used as a tool to generate the greatest happiness? Then, because there's nothing economists like more than jargon, they call this happiness utility and attempt to graph it, using money forgone as one simple measure. So utilitarianism is basically the idea that whatever provides the greatest amount of happiness is right. Now, that's an oversimplification, and real modern utilitarians layer that with caveats. But that's a core idea. Happiness is what matters. Maximising it is good. This leads to more equal outcomes than either of those other models, and therefore it's egalitarian, at least in comparison. Robert Nozick's point, to be oversimplified for role-playing purposes, is this. Say you're sharing a chocolate cake with a friend, and neither of you has a stronger systemic right to the cake, the bypassing of which would prevent people in future having cakes. Most people would cut the cake down the middle. Let's call your friend Bob. Bob loves chocolate. Bob is a super taster, so he can enjoy chocolate in ways you can't even imagine. Is it still ethical to cut the cake down the middle? Bob gets a lot more out of the cake than you do. Is it right for you to have half the cake, which for you is basically nice, when it could instead be given to Bob, for whom it is a transcendent and glorious experience? Shouldn't, in short, all the cake go to Bob? Shouldn't, to extrapolate, all the cake always go to Bob? Doesn't this increase global happiness the most? You may feel a bit put out by the loss of cake, but Bob is basically swimming in happiness, so in either total terms or average terms, utility is up tremendously if you no longer get any cake. Now, Bob is one of Nozick's utility monsters, but we can push it further, as Nozick does, to make it more suited for gaming. Imagine Bob is a super taster, and he reaches heights of ecstasy not understood by mere mortals, but to have this experience he needs to eat people. Nozick points out, in this thought experiment, a utilitarian has a moral duty to feed himself to the monster. Dying in Bob's mouth becomes a moral obligation, and failing to die becomes evil. This is because utilitarianism is consequentialist. What matters to utilitarians is the outcome, not the motive. In Mythic Europe, the existence of the particular god that is there makes utilitarianism false, because obedience matters more than outcomes, and he says don't feed the monsters, thereby defining evil as non-consequentialist. That being said, characters can fall into error if they believe that any highest value other than divine obedience exists, and the obvious group to tempt with this is House Yarburton. If beauty is all that pleases, as their motto says, if their highest value is beauty, is it right to feed peasants to a demon which is either transcendently beautiful of itself or has the muse virtue, allowing the creation of transcendent beauty? This gives diabolists something to want other than unspecified power. If you head on over to the blog attached to the podcast, there are stats for a Lord of the False Gods who looks like a stained glass butterfly that has the dark muse power. So you feed it peasants and you become an exceptional artist. I'd like to note the possible link into the Quest of the Queen's Tears, the Dunsany episode for last month, in which we discussed the gladsome beast, a beast that's the happiest thing in fairy but eats men. It might also be used as a utility monster.